when Rhonda and I were married after about 5 years, she became pregnant and she got late into her pregnancy and we lost that child. I'm going to save all the listeners from the details, but it was something that I had never seen, something that I had never gone through. And it really messed me up, but it did drop me to my knees because I then began to see birth as a miracle.
Hey everybody, before we jump into today's episode, we'd like to recognize all those who make this podcast possible. The Lead Today show is supported by all the generous donors of the Lead Today community. Thank you so much for investing in shaping leaders through this podcast. And be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you are watching or listening today. All right, let's jump into the podcast.
I want to start off with a leadership question. Maybe it's a statement, maybe it's a leading question, but do we believe that investing in the well-being of our family members will make a difference, not only with those that we know, but those that will come after our kids and our grandkids? Do we have that kind of a long-term view of the work it means, or the work it is, the work that's involved in being a spiritual leader of our homes? That's the question that came to mind when I read through and studied Genesis chapter 5. So that's what we're going to pick up today. I have with me Gary Harpst and Winston Harris. Glad you guys are with us. Let me read a little bit of it and skip through the whole chapter here real quick. And then there's some really great questions that we decided that we're going to talk about today. So we invite the listeners to lean in and enjoy this. This is Genesis chapter 5. And it says, "This is the written account of the descendants of Adam. When God created human beings, he made them to be like himself. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and called them human." All right, this is when I'm going to do a little bit of skipping. I will hit every verse, but I'm not going to read every word of every verse. It says, when Adam was 130 years old, he became the father of a son that was just like him. In his very image, it says. He named his son Seth. So we're not talking about Cain and Abel. We're talking about Seth, someone who came later. It goes on to say that Adam lived for an additional 800 years and continued to have sons and daughters. He lived about 930 years of age. That's a long time. Seth, when he was 105 years old, he became the father of Enosh. And he lived another 807 years, having more sons and daughters. His total years on earth was 912, and then he died. His son Enosh was 90 when he became a father, and he lived for 815 years after, for a total of 905 years. And then he died. And by the way, his son was Kenan. Now, when Kenan was 70, he became the father of Mahalalel. I don't know if I pronounced that right. And after his birth, he lived 840 additional years, making it a total, and having sons and daughters, and making it a total of 910 years. And then with his son, Mahalalel, he was 65 years old when he became the father of Jared. And he lived another 830 years, having sons and daughters, as they all have before him. He lived a total of 895 years, and then he died. Jared was 162 when he became the father of Enoch. He lived an additional 800 years, and then he died at 962 years. Jared did. Enoch was 65 when he became the father of Methuselah. And he lived an additional 300 years. This is a wrinkle in the story. It says Enoch lived in close fellowship with God for another 300 years. So that's an added commentary here. And during those 300 years, he had other sons and daughters. Enoch lived 365 years, walking in close fellowship with God, and then one day he disappeared, the text says, because God took him. So that's a wrinkle. When his son Methuselah was 187 years old, he became the father of Lamech. Now that's a different Lamech than we listed under Cain's genealogy. This is a different Lamech. And he lived an additional 782 years, had boys and girls, sons and daughters. He lived 969 years, and then he died. We're almost done. When Lamech was 182, he became the father of a son, and his name was Noah. And here comes another wrinkle. In this text, there's another commentary, another note that says that he named him Noah because he said, may he bring us relief from our work and the painful labor of farming this ground that the Lord has cursed. Lamech lived another 595 years, having sons and daughters, for a total of 777 years, and then he died. This chapter ends, finally, with this verse. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So for those of you who are thinking about reading the Bible and you're going, gosh, is every chapter going to be like this? No, it's not. But guys, when we read through this, there's got to be some questions that we answer. Why is it so important for God to list this genealogy for us to read through? And what are other thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, I think the genealogy is important because what's to come, right? There's a narrative that's been playing out. If you've been reading scripture, if you've been following along with us, or if you're familiar with what is coming, we're kind of bridging the gap and kind of pivoting to another narrative that we'll get into in Genesis chapter 6. The story of Noah and the flood and whatnot. So not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but this is kind of, just practically speaking, a bridge, that we're being set up for, a framework, if you will. So to your point, if anybody's like reading this and they're like, this is really boring. Why do I need to read this? It definitely is going somewhere. But I think under the layers of this too, you start to see a framework that God desires to achieve his purpose through family and through generations, that God is a generational God. And so you're seeing this, practical picture of a lineage, genealogy that it's not just one generation, it's not just one person, and just in a small a picture of we're all a part of a greater narrative, and in a culture, in a landscape that makes us the main character. I think it's a refreshing reminder that there's so much more that's happened before us, and there's so much more that will happen after us, and we get to play our part in the relay race, if you will. Thinking about is it is it is it Hebrews 12? Run your race. Great account of witnesses that are cheering us on. And so run your race with endurance, right?
Which follows the chapter of the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, right? Yeah.
Yep. So just thinking about that kind of relay, if you will, and this is setting us up for this idea of generations, of legacy, of family, and we get to play our part. We get to run our race and hand the baton off at some point.
I couldn't agree more with what you're laying out here. I would also mention that implied in this is this challenge we have of propagating from generation to generation. So roughly in 10 generations, things went to pieces. And, there's sort of a, I don't know if the word evil talks about sort of like decay, like a really rot, or what we'd think of a rust or an apple or something. And when something's decaying, it goes slowly and then all of a sudden fast, and so you see a little bit of that in these 10 generations, that the deterioration is coming at the end. And you can almost see in that, or you can see in some of the narrative, men abusing women and just viewing them as objects, and sort of the sexual degradation that's going on, and all that. A theory, Jim, I know we sometimes get out on the limb talking about things we can't substantiate, but I've wondered if there is something in the 10 generations that their generations live much longer. But it's interesting to me that most societies don't last much more than 10 generations in today's world. So if a generation's age today is 40 years roughly for reproducing the next, then most countries don't last much longer than 10 generations, which is 400 years today. And it makes me wonder whether there's something, it's not so much time-based, but as the dilution that occurs from generation to generation, that the handoff, that by the time 10 come around, it's decayed a lot. And so that's just no charge for that. That's
Well, yeah, there's a fork in the road here, is what I see, and for me, it's highly convicting. We were just in chapter 4 where we looked at the descendants of Cain, and then it kind of fell off the cliff. And as far as we know, there's not a whole lot of information about that family tree thereafter, other than that they must have been included in this broad statement that all men were evil before the flood, and God rightly judging, smearing the earth of all humanity, and then we get to this place in Genesis chapter 5 where we just read through this genealogy, which doesn't necessarily imply that everybody here did wonderful. It obviously didn't. Gary, that's what you're saying. It obviously didn't, because as we know, what comes next is, as the curtain opens and we get into chapter 6, we're going to get a look at, all right, so how did these people do? And here's the crazy thing. We're not even talking about the fork in the road that we don't have any information. I mean, we're just left off the cliff with Cain's family, and it's almost like just utter destruction, not even worth talking about anymore. And then we get over to chapter 5, which of course we know is, in spite of these folks, with some exceptions, this is the redemptive path. When you talked about decay and what you said, as usual, you bring something in to our conversation that is visual and is very helpful. When I was walking down my patio to come into the studio to talk with you guys today about Genesis chapter 5, I noticed that on my iron railing coming down the stairs, on the left side at the bottom, where the bolts are secured into the cement, there is a tremendous amount of rust and decay. Now, what cracks me up is we just worked on that a couple of years ago. And I do remember seeing about 6 months ago or so what appeared to be some rust coming back. But today, it looks like I could just go over there and push the railing over. I hope that's not the case, but I think that's a good illustration how much we need to be aware of compromising who we are. And coming back to the question I started with at the top of the podcast, do we love our families enough? Do we love God enough to where because those closest to us are the hardest to lead, and we know of their faults probably better than anyone else, and they know of ours in the same way. Yet we are the ones on call. We're the ones in the game. And when somebody reads down our family tree, 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 generations from now, assuming that the earth is continuing in its way, what will they be able to say? Will our presence manifest in a positive way down to those generations, or are we so short-sighted that we either give up or we just focus on making everybody happy, or whatever that looks like on this side? What I was struck by right from the beginning is, in the Hebrew, the word Adam means human. And it's already stated earlier on that God made man in his own likeness. And yet, Moses is repeating that here once again. Um, so, this Hebrew word for Adam is human, and yet he wants to do his work through humanity. But then we get to this guy named Enoch. Every time we put God in a box about what he will do and what he can't do, that's what jumped out at me. Because it says he died, 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 he died. Oh, Enoch? Well, God
He
took
didn't.
him.
He didn't die. Yeah.
And I like how the NLT says it. He disappeared.
It almost feels like a nod to the gospel in some ways, um, because it distinctly says he was walking with God. So there's like a delineation between him and everybody else, right? Like Moses could have easily specified that, other guys are walking with God and then died. But for some reason, the guy who ends up not dying was the one that was walking with God. So it's almost like a nod to what's going to be available to those who end up putting their faith in Christ, is that, when you are walking with God, there is a death that is not available to you that is going to be available to others. And so it's almost like this, I've heard it said this way, that the the New Testament is just the Old Testament being clarified, right? And so there's some things that are hidden in the Old Testament. There's some things that are kind of hidden here in Genesis that end up being unveiled, in the New Testament. And so to me, I almost kind of see just like a little crumb, if you will, a little inkling of, what's to come, that, of all the
Well,
people that didn't die, he was the one that was walking with God.
yeah, those of us who've grown up in the West, we have a good way of using Gary's term, uh, corroding even good stuff. So this is going to have some measure of corrosion in it, because everything in me wants to put everything into an equation and make sense, out of everything. So in recognizing that, I can't help but say it. There's all kinds of people who say they believe in God and they do try to live, what we sometimes call God-fearers, God and country kind of people. And then you get the people who are that, and they go to church, and they just have that, what we call that good old fashioned American Christianity, kind of thing. But then you got the people who are seeking after God. They're talking to God on a regular basis. And I mean, that's almost what it feels like, to me, is that, you don't, the scripture's not slamming these people, but pulling out Enoch and saying this guy was walking in fellowship with God. Well, how did that happen? Did that happen because God reached down and said, "Hey, I'm going to reveal myself to you in a unique way"? It's possible, right? That is possible. Or is it that 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 he pursued this faith relationship to such a place where it was a daily a daily thing, truly believing that God is near and walking with him in that way. I mean, that's what it seems like to me. It's almost like they were already in conversation and he was location planet Earth and then he wasn't. And they were still having same conversation. That's kind of how I see it.
Maybe it's a precursor to the rapture.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's, yeah, for those who don't understand how that could be, well, this is a microcosm of how that could be. He just disappeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He went somewhere.
I think it's also could be pulled out as an encouragement, right? Like in the midst of these generations where it's just essentially surrounded by death, and there's this tradition of interacting with God or experiencing God in one way, and it doesn't have to be that way in every generation, right? And Enoch experiences something different than everybody else. Do we know why he did? No, but we know that it's possible that just because there were 3 generations before me that experienced God a certain way or didn't experience God at all doesn't mean it has to be that way in my generation. And I have hope that I can be a catalyst. I can be different. I can be the first. Back to your initial question, Jim, about do we love God or do we love our family enough to make an impact in our generation that will be felt in other generations? I think this is a nod here to the fact that I don't have to accept what's always been. I can have the courage enough to say, I don't like the direction my family's heading. I don't like the way that, I saw my parents or didn't see my parents interact with God, or the way that, people in my family didn't serve others and only serve themselves. It can be different in my generation if I choose to pursue that.
Hey everyone, we're going to take a brief break from the podcast to let you know our very own Jim Piper has released a brand new book called Story, The Art of Learning from Your Past. Everyone has a past, but not everyone learns from it. Jim unpacks lessons in this book that help leaders and learners understand the potential our past has to impact our present and our future. Be sure to grab your copy of Story where books are sold. All right? Let's get back to the podcast.
There's always a way to fight for your family, regardless of what you have done to screw it up.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, if you can do nothing else, you can fall on your knees and you can pray for your family. But you can also change yourself. You can work with God to grow and to change and become a different person. Those two things, nobody can stop you from doing. We don't even have to talk about the tactics and the habits and all those things, which would be worth talking about. But there is no reason. And I think the other thing is that we've talked a lot about having faith in the sovereignty of God, that God is in charge. But he's not aloof. But the temptation is to get a little agnostic and believing that God is aloof, because, in fact, Gary, I think you have spoken to this more than any of the rest of us in the Genesis Project. Is that we just don't like God's timing. He does not move the way we want him to move when we want him to move. And that creates a crack in our faith, which has an impact on our obedience or disobedience. And what that does is that decays. That decays. It hurts us. Now, I want you guys to respond to this. All right. So we already got this first wrinkle. I mean, everything else is pretty legit here. It's almost like a repeat of the earlier chapters in Genesis, reminding us that God has a purpose for us. He's going to do his work through us. We have this list of all these people that live almost forever, but then we're reminded, oh, they died. Gary, you have said in previous podcast another phrase that caught my attention, something to the extent of you pointed out that as particularly for those of us who have sickness, if you struggle with physical sickness in some way, shape, or form, or you're just simply aging, like a couple of us on this podcast are, and then it feels like a sickness, even if we're not technically sick.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like sick. And you have said, in God's mercy, he does not make us live in this state forever. There comes a time where he rescues us out of this. But we get this, what looks to me towards the end of this chapter. I'd really like to get your views on this, because I've been wrestling with this for a couple weeks now. What appears to me is that I know that in ancient times, sometimes a child would be named beforehand. but often they'd be named later, and not just a day later. They would look at their personality, they would look at their family, they would look at all kinds of indicators to try to appropriately name a child, and often based upon their faith or lack of faith. This seems like a premonition to me. It says, Lamech named his son Noah, for he said, may he bring us, or at least a prayer, may he bring us relief. May this one bring us relief from our work and painful labor of farming this ground that the Lord has cursed. I don't think Noah did that. I don't think he changed agriculture, but he
There,
did.
there is some commentaries in the Jewish realm that suggest he invented the plow. I don't know if you've
I have
heard
not
that.
heard that. I have not heard that. No.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's true, but the Jewish rabbinical literature has a lot of history that
We don't.
they've recorded. Whether how accurate it is, I don't know, but I believe that's one theory. Another theory I heard was that the curse. I didn't actually go back. We looked in chapter 3 about the fall of man. That the curse was for the lifetime of Adam. Is that correct? There's some theories about that the
Right.
curse was for the lifetime. When was Noah? Didn't Adam die? Do
Well,
you remember
no,
Winston
no,
in the?
I think you're onto something because again, when you read this chapter, just about all of these characters would have known Adam
Yeah,
if you do the math.
yeah. I was thinking Noah might have been the first generation that
Yeah.
saw Adam die. So I don't have that well researched.
Well,
But
but I think that's interesting, right? I mean, it's either a prayer of blessing, like the father, or maybe or patriarch anyway of a family would be able to do, but it wasn't necessarily at birth. So, to me, if anything, it was like as the patriarch was dying, you would have the blessing, the anointing, and here it almost feels to me like it's a premonition of some sort. And if you're right that Noah did invent the plow, well, first of all, the dude's a hero because can you imagine farming without a plow? My goodness. And then secondly, of course, we know um, how he and God were involved in this incredible building of the ark and the saving of humanity, in that way.
Yeah, back to your you made a statement about fighting for your family more or less, and you know me personally, my wife and I were expecting in March, and for our first child, for our first daughter, we had the name kind of picked out. We had kind of been dreaming and planning for a family for years, and so we had her name ready to go as soon as she got here. Uh, the second go round, we're struggling to land on a name, and so we're kind of going back and forth, and we're discussing, and there's like a different level of expectation that we're trying to wrap our minds around. There's just so much expectation around the first child, and life has changed in so many different ways. In the second go round, it's almost kind of like, yeah, we know what to expect, right? And so even me personally, I'm trying to, with God, wrap my mind around, okay, how do I get a different level of expectation for the person that she is? This will be a baby girl. How will she be different than my first child? How will life be different? With her. And I think there's something to be said about expectation here, right? And the fact that there's this prayer of expectation. But when we talk about fighting for our families, like even having this future forward faith that says, I don't know what my family is going to look like. I don't know what this child is going to look like, but I'm going to be bold enough to pray a prayer, even if it doesn't even make sense. Like he will comfort us in our labor and painful toil. And that's not even what necessarily maybe he did, but he was someone who changed the trajectory of generations to come, and we'll get into all that. But the faith enough to pray a prayer of expectation that this child will be different, this generation will be different, versus just being apathetic and just sitting in your current circumstances. Maybe there's a parent listening to this, and there's just no hope, right? You're just like, why even bother? And I think there's a level of expectation that we're called to have, that however that plays out tangibly, if you have the faith to pray a prayer like this, it's going to affect your um, it's going to affect your natural response. If you have a supernatural perspective to pray a prayer that the next generation is going to be different, then your natural response, parenting them a certain way with that expectation, is going to create a space and an opportunity for it to actually happen.
Kind of, I like the emphasis you're bringing on the generational responsibility, if you will. And I remember hearing one commentator one time say it's easy to make children, or let's see, it's easy to something like it's different to have a child than it is to have a son. That making the distinction about conceiving a child is one thing, birthing a child, but raising the next generation, truly raising the next generation. And one of the things that I'm kind of cursed, or that's not the right word, but I think very systematically, that's just kind of the way God's wired my mind. And one of the things you see, and I've seen in my own family, is each generation brings with it a new set of challenges. Like my parents grew up in the Depression, and their view of success in life, they didn't really worry that much or think that much about self-fulfillment. They simply thought about how do we feed the family? And I will do whatever it takes and forget what I like. I will just do what it takes. Well, because they did that, I grew up with a whole different set of things. They had taken care of me and given me opportunity. And interestingly, you look in the Deuteronomy 8 sort of characterization of the decay of societies. We, as parents, we do better building on our past, but it gives our kids, they don't understand the fight it took to get that. And it actually becomes kind of a curse that as you get more prosperous, each generation has a harder and harder time seeing their need for God. And, there's something wired in us as parents. It's so hard. You want to protect your kids from hardship, all those things. But those are the things that drew us closer to God in the first place. And my point in all this is your generational emphasis is exactly right. But there's this thing that goes on from generation to generation that actually changes the game each generation. And you can see it in America in particular, where now my kids simply do not understand, or their kids, they have no clue of the idea of the things I did growing up, about work and what you have to do. And it's not their fault. They don't know any different. You see what I'm getting at? It's not really their fault that they grew up with social media.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're not. Yeah, you don't mean to be discouraging when you say that, but it is a discouraging thought, right? Because you know, uh, in one of my previous podcasts, speaking with a leader who was talking about that psychology, technology, and leadership have advanced to such a level that he was saying, I think we can do really good church without God, and
Yeah.
that's a really scary
Yeah.
thing.
Yes.
Because you go to school to learn how to preach, and I mean, just about everything you need, how to reach out, how to finance, how to do all these things. And I think one of the things that my dad said to me when I was, starting to come up the ranks in the corporate America, and he started seeing some of the things that I was able to take advantage of as different, from his day and age. He said, Jim, I didn't even know those opportunities existed. I just put my head down, went to work, and provided, for my family. And it's interesting because even today, with my my grandchildren. Well, let me back up. I want to go back to what I said right at the beginning. If there's nothing else we can do, we can pray for our family, and we ourselves can be salt and light. We can be that. And I bring that up because it was a long time ago, before I was a dad. And I think this is when it happened to me, and God is my witness, so I don't know exactly, but I think it was when Rhonda and I were married. After about 5 years, she became pregnant, and she got late into her pregnancy, and we lost that child. And we didn't just lose that child; it was a horrific event. I'm going to save all the listeners from the details, but it was something that I had never seen, something that I had never gone through, and it really messed me up in a lot of ways. But it did drop me to my knees, because I then began to see birth as a miracle. I began to see it that way, and I began to pray for my next child, and for my wife, and for her health. And somewhere in that process, not only did I start beginning to pray for the child I didn't even know, or what his or her name would be, how old they would be, what they would do. I began praying for their friends. I began
Mm,
praying for their spouse. I
mm,
began
mm,
praying for their children.
mm,
And the thing that comes against me today, being a grandfather of 7, is that I am so, this is my confession slash uh, recognition of still needing to be more dependent on God, is that I am so busy today, and so I'll even say it, sometimes worried about those 7 grandchildren and their parents, because if what my dad said to me was true, it's 5, 6, 7 times more true for
mhm,
my kids and me.
mhm,
And now there's just like this equation. You get good grades, you go to this kind of a school, you get this degree, and this is just what you do. It's how you do it, it's how the world works. But where is, God guide me, God help me, God show me. There's those kinds of things. So what I have to confess today is that my basket is so blessed that I have to remember that I need to be praying continually for their spouses. None of them are old enough to get married yet. Their spouses and those children that I will, the majority of them for sure, I will not meet, and beyond and beyond and beyond. Um, that's what chapter 5 has hit me with, because if you think about it, let me just get this part done. If you think about it, he starts off once again reminding us that our life counts. That's what that's what the first 2 verses yell. Your life counts. Well, if my life counts, and there's a record here in the Bible of these people, isn't there a record somewhere else of my genealogy and my family, and my engagement into partnering with God to fulfill his mission here on the earth? That's that's what really hit me as I was reading Genesis chapter 5.
You said it a few times, but for us to be, salt, and in this, idea of genealogies and how quickly things can decay, made me think about, salt in the ancient times being used as a preservative, to prevent food from decaying, allowing it to last longer. And as we're talking about generations and family, and how each generation has a different felt need, how each generation has a different experience, those experiences create decay, right? And the tension that we wrestle with is that there is the propensity for a distance to occur over generations between the generation and God, right? And so when we're salt, what we're doing is we're preserving generations. We're allowing generations to know God in their experience, in their context, so that what happened actually in Judges 2, I believe, when Joshua ends up dying, it says a generation arose that didn't know who God was, right? And that would be the failure, is that in our family lineage, in the genealogy of our family, that we dropped the baton. We weren't salt to our family in a way that preserved them, so that every generation got a an encounter with Christ, a value in our family, that we seek God like Enoch did. We walk with God like Enoch did. That should be the standard of the value that carries on through our lineage. But that's not guaranteed, and that's the danger of not fighting for our family, is that there could be a generation that arises that doesn't know God.
I think most leaders get weary, they get exhausted because it's a big job to lead yourself, for goodness sake. And now, what we're saying, and the implication here, is that we're called to lead our families. But let's remind ourselves, and every other leader, that every family, it's not just your family that's got weird stuff. Every family has got garbage. And in every family tree, you have a history of all kinds of things. Now, what my genealogy struggles with, generally and specifically, may be different than yours, but we all have it. We all have it. Some families have strong lines of alcoholism. Some have of some sort of physical or history of sexual abuse. Some have these genes of cancer that spread through one family more than others. Some have learning disabilities. Some, I mean, I can go on and on. Family feuds, unfaithfulness. Um, uh, why does my family quit? Why are there so many quitters in my family? Why? These are hypothetical questions that you probably don't have that full basket. But I think what happens is that you get discouraged and you look over the fence and you go, the Joneses, they look like they have their act together, and the Smiths look like they have their act together. Why is my family so backwards? Why are we so dysfunctional? I'm just going to throw in the towel and start another family. I'm going to just repeat what has been going on. What the message that I want to say, besides the praying and the growing ourselves, is to try to remember that without exception, every family tree has a history and a story and a difficulty. And rise up to that, understand that, fight off shame, and recognize that what a great mission it is to have a wonderful impact on your family. It is your first mission field. It is your first opportunity. And no matter how much you may have contributed to it, you have a whole new opportunity in front of you. And that's, like I said, prayer and personal change.
And Jim, this opening of chapter 5 says, repeats Genesis 1. It says, God created us in his likeness. And if you really look at the behavior of humankind, and we are wired to have dominion. We crave to build things, make things, etc. Well, men in particular, it seems like there's always, maybe it's an overgeneralization, but men in particular crave going out and fighting the battle, building their business, building their ministry, building things. but they don't see, and I'm talking to me, we don't see the same energy and intention in building our family. You see what I'm getting at? And it takes the same kind of thought, intention, goals, time, and energy to build into our family. And it's not our natural instincts. And most mothers have that instinct to build into the family. But, if you look in America, the failure, at least in Ohio, I'm working with some fellow that's going to run for governor, and the statistics, it's the destruction of the family that is destroying the society. And like 75, 80% of the kids that are born or having abortions are from single parent families. And a single woman's income in Ohio is $28,000. A married couple is 95. And yet we're trying to bail out the symptoms with more social programs and more rescues and more budget, when in reality God's way is to build the family, like you've been saying, Winston. And you can't do it, you can't delegate it to somebody else. You have to do it yourself. And I'm talking to myself here, but men need to step up. And so I'm having long talks with my sons, and they're doing well, but it takes time and it takes energy and intentionality.
I think that is a great place to end chapter 5. And the soundbite that slapped me up across the face was, if there's one area we cannot delegate, it's the leading of our family.
Thank you for joining us here at the Today Count Show. Be sure to like and subscribe on whatever platform you listen or watch so you don't miss any content. And stay tuned for more coming soon.